pause. Just a reminder, welcome everyone, and just let you know that the NADTC, the National Aging Disability Transportation Center, strives to provide accurate information on the ADA, but what we provide is technical assistance and it's not legal advice. And so we say that so that people don't say, oh, you know, Ken Thompson said, you know, and we go with it. So it's technical assistance to help you, you know, in your thinking and planning around different kinds of issues. And, you know, we'll give you some other pointers as to other places you may go to get other legal advice. All right, the session objectives is that we're going to talk about the ADA complaint process for transportation. And then at the end, we'll talk somewhat, spend a little bit of time because I think they're really interrelated, reasonable modification requirements and implementation for transportation providers. So those were really the 2 points we'll cover. And just a reminder that the complaints are a requirement of the ADA under the Title II, state and local government entities and public transportation. It's enforced by the DOJ, but regulated by the DOT, which is Department of Transportation. And Title III also, the public accommodations for private transportation would be those providers that are not primarily engaged in transportation, and also taxis, limos, transportation network companies, that's like Uber and Lyft and related type entities. All right, complaints. Complaints can be made for ADA complaints under the transportation provider existing process. So you may see, you know, just a general complaint form. Some providers have a specific checkoff for ADA complaints, but others just will have general complaints. And then in the complaint type or discussion area, you write what type of complaint it is. And the whole idea of complaints with the ADA is that, you know, the complaints are necessary for transit providers to serve to resolve service issues and discriminations. And without the complaints, a lot of times situations may be ignored or even not acted upon, or maybe not even considered problematic. So it's very important that people do make complaints to ensure that service is provided in a way that is not discriminatory, or that service is provided in a way that is usable for that individual. The process is local. We get calls a lot of times about, you know, people complaining and wanting to see if I or somebody else will approve the process, and that's not really my role or anybody else's. It's up to the local transit providers, and we say the transit providers get input from your local disability community on the process that will work, and that input is really important to get a process that really becomes part of a dialogue between the provider and people with disabilities. And in that way, a lot of times CILs, Centers for Independent Living, often can assist with that process, and they will also provide information to the process to ensure that complaints are resolved in a way that is equitable to everyone. So we tell transit providers and other providers that, you know, adopt complaint procedures that provide prompt and equitable resolutions to complaints. So, you know, the whole point is that, you know, years ago, I remember, you know, hearing stories that, well, people said, oh, I put in a complaint. And I said, how long ago was it? And they said, oh, it's been a month. And have you heard anything? And they go, not yet. And is that very prompt? You know, that's when we all were like, well, you know, there needs to be some kind of action to ensure that you get feedback quickly to find out what's going on with your complaint. So prompt, it's equitable, and to make sure that you know what's going on with your complaint, we talk to transit providers and others that, hey, have an interactive process for the investigation, meaning that you talk to the person making the complaint as you talk to other people. Don't do that thing where, well, we talk to all of our people within the provider side and then go to the individual. We say it's best to have an interactive process as you move through your investigation and follow up with the individual so they know what is being discussed on both sides. And the requirement now is in complaint process is that there is a record of communication. So whenever there is a phone call, whenever there's an email, whenever there's any kind of communication, there is a record of the communication and what was said. There's also a requirement in the requirements that complaints, the actual copies of the complaint itself, meaning the original complaint form plus follow-up activities and notes are all maintained for at least 1 year. So that's the current, basically, complaints that could be reviewed. And then a summary of complaints must be maintained. That could be a spreadsheet or some other way where there's just a log of details and resolution where someone could look at complaints and say, hey, here's a theme or a topic that comes up frequently that needs to be addressed. So 1 year for the actual original complaint and 5 years for the record of details. Additional procedures, key point, I mentioned that issue of someone calling and saying they hadn't heard for a month. If you designate one employee that's responsible for implementation of complaints and basically the follow-up activities, then there's a better chance that you can find out what happened to your complaint. So designate employee, a policy and procedure, procedure where once a complaint is received, how would the decision process be implemented, and then have deadlines as to when certain actions would occur. We like to say when a complaint comes in, we tell providers communicate with an individual that makes the complaint that the complaint is received, and then to let them know that discussions will continue and communication will continue at various points as that complaint is being investigated. So there is an interactive process. And then the other point is that providers must advertise their complaint process to let people know, here's how you make a complaint. One thing we like to try to say is don't have your complaint process information buried on the website. If it's more than a couple clicks away, you're not going to find it, right? I've been on some websites with an individual who wants to make a complaint. So we get on a website, say with a provider, and we start looking for the complaint process, and we go, oh, where is this? And somewhere in the buried part of the website, multiple clicks later, we find it, and we say, yes, we said that's not the place to put your complaint. And, ideally, you would like to see it on a public-facing first page. To make a complaint, click here. That would be ideal. Second page, possibly, but no more than that. And then we want to ensure that information is accessible. And I think I have I said information says us accessible. So say ensure information is accessible for individuals. And that is a point we talked to a lot of providers. We say, is your website accessible? Is your complaint process accessible? And sometimes you get an interesting response. They go, we don't know. And so need to test it out. All right, rider information. You know, a lot of these things are pretty basic, and some of these are kind of fixed route, but because I've used this presentation and generally in a lot of different areas, but if you don't have fixed route, still this kind of information is all really important, no matter who your provider is. Date and time and location. I have cross intersections helpful, and that's really kind of a fixed route thing if there's an issue around a bus stop. But if there's an accident or sort of an issue, you know, between an operator and an individual, sometimes where it happened, you know, where the vehicle is located, is very important. And then if you're using a mobility aid or any kind of equipment, and there's some either boarding, deboarding, or securement issue, the mobility aid information is important also. If it's the mode, if it's a demand response, a shuttle or whatever, or the route, it's important to have that information along with a vehicle ID. And sometimes, you know, if you're working with the human service providers, vehicle, you know, sometimes there's not a number that you can see as a passenger as to the number of the vehicle. And sometimes it's not all that obvious. And also any personnel involved, so you get the names, and if people have ID numbers and that sort of thing, get that information. And you know, make sure you have the accurate name of the individuals involved. If there's somebody else from the provider that comes out to a location where there's an issue, try to get the information of that person. That could be a supervisor or someone else that's assisting. Have that information too. And then a clear description of the incident itself and any immediate follow-up actions that you know the person did around the incident, or the provider even said they will be doing. And so some provider says, oh yes, okay, yeah, this is a problem and we're going to follow up with, say, the operations manager. Well, you want to know, you know, did that happen? And that was what was stated. And then very important, and even in even smaller vehicles now, there are video and sometimes recordings of conversations that are available that can be gotten and obtained when looking at complaints and issues. Providers. The providers, we say you must always, of course, have the date of the complaint, that when it's received, and make sure that's accurate. And then providers must also assign a date for investigation. When did it start and who's going to do it? And you know, it's interesting sometimes. You know, we hear providers and small providers that say, "Oh, everything runs through the director." And if that's the case, well, then at least you know, if the director's doing it, that's fine. But are there other people within an organization? It might be a transportation supervisor, it might be a maintenance person, it might be, you know, other drivers, somebody else may be involved. You know, just because it's running through the director does not always say that the director is going to be doing the investigation, or there may be communication with other individuals. And then as far as any communication with the rider, have the dates and information for that communication and what was discussed. Finally, of course, is the date of resolution. You know, what happened, how did we resolve it, and basically, is there satisfaction? So the final resolution is, here's the resolution, but there could be follow-up. The person, the rider may say, hey, I'm not happy with your decision. You know, it's not solving my problem. I would like some other action, or I would like some other change in the way that you provide service so I can get my ride. So those are kinds of information that must be provided. And then part of communication, we like to say that individuals should commute with the provider. I say transit up here, but it's really any provider. Could be private, could be public, it could be human service agencies. Communicate when the complaint is received. and make sure that both sides understand. You sent the complaint and they have it. And then also there's communication between the person making the complaint and other staff within that transit agency as they investigate or look into it. And then something we like to tell people is make sure you go through and try to clarify that the record is clear on the time, the date, the bus vehicle issue involved, and any details on that complaint, but just to verify it again. So you put in a complaint, you may discuss it once, but it's always good to try again and say, hey, how is our, here's the information. You still have it right? Is it still correct? So again, after your complaint is made, verify information, the drivers, any supervisors, police, if police are involved, police records. Sometimes, we've had cases where people said, yeah, we contacted the police and they said they'll take care of it. Or someone, the police says, yeah, I got a record. And then people go back to the police and they don't really have a clear information about that particular issue. And there's no name of the police officer or anybody investigating from the police side to follow up in an easy way. And if you get any passengers or witnesses, you want to clarify who they are and their information. And of course, verify again the description details of the event. So you want to talk that over with the provider too to make sure that the information is accurate. And then if it's not, amend that information that you provide. So even sometimes in the course of a issue, when you first put in complaint, sometimes you'll get other information, or maybe even sometimes our clarity and our thinking changes a little, and we may want to amend some of that information in the future. So here's a little situation that we want to think about that's pretty common. We wish it wouldn't happen, but say the van does not arrive. So the trip is missed by the provider. They didn't send it out. So you want to have that, make sure you have the time to schedule trip, the period of time the rider is waiting for the trip. How long did you sit out there and say, hey, where is it? Or, you're looking out the house going, my ride's supposed to be here. Time the provider is contacted, ride didn't show, you contacted 15 minutes, half an hour later. And then what response did you get from the provider? Sometimes we hear stories that the driver is contacted and the driver says, oh yeah, I was there. Well, the individual says, hey, I've been sitting out here, no one showed up. And so then you have the discussion as to where did the driver actually go? Was the driver there? Was the driver there earlier? Or was the driver at the wrong address? And then what response did you get from that provider about your issue? They say, oh no, the driver's there. Is it your word? And then if someone else is with that rider, then you'd have that additional kind of witness for the issue. Here's something that we still hear a lot about. A situation where a service dog is refused. So, of course, providers are prohibited from denying service dogs under the ADA, but, sometimes you hear stories where sometimes a driver pulls up and says, no, that's not a service dog. It's not, look at it. It's not a service dog, the way it behaves. You don't know the reason. And the driver refuses to allow the animal to board. And what did the driver say? What happened in that discussion? So, of course, you want the actual discussion. Why was it refused? Time of the trip, the incident, the issue, the vehicle. Did the vehicle pull up and just leave because there are no animals? And a lot of times this can happen, with some private providers. and we hear it a lot more around, you know, Uber and Lyft, you know, the transportation network companies, where you have individuals in their cars saying, hey, I don't want a dog in my car. And they go, well, it's a service animal. And the individual goes, well, it's a dog. They say no. So again, of course, you know, you have that, you know who your driver is from the appointment, but on the other hand, you know, you may have to have information on the vehicle type, the color of the vehicle, in a situation like that. And you may have the driver's name, but you may not have a clear detail as to who your driver is. So you want to make sure you can capture that information. And again, it's a case where if there's anyone else that witnessed that issue, that would be important too. So again, complaints for transportation should be done with your provider. If you're not satisfied after you make that complaint, the Federal Transit Administration, that's the FTA, also has a process where individuals can make complaints about any problems you have with the provider. So any public, private, any publicly funded provider, you can contact the Federal Transit Administration. So they may look into the particular issue to see if something needs to be resolved. But the key point on any kind of complaint before you go to Federal Transit Administration is make sure that you do your local complaint first. The Federal Transit Administration has a complaint form, and you can just there's a link I have on the screen that can be used to get to that form, or you can do it simply if you're doing a Google search, say FTA ADA complaint, and that will come up as the first form. There we go. And then additionally, DOJ complaints can be filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office anywhere, or you can do an email complaint. This is for like private transportation providers with ada.complaint@usdoj.gov. And there is also an online form, civil rights, https://civilrights.justice.gov /report/, but that's another way with that. Or you can simply call the ADA line at 800-514-0301 to make a complaint. All right, we're at a point after our little discussion on complaints to have some questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about reasonable modification of policy. Questions?
Okay, I just unmuted the line or opened the line up for the caller. Go ahead.
Hi, I think I've got the buttons pushed right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ha, thank you. Thank you so much. I have disabilities that the symptoms of which are triggered by fragrances, and I have had no luck talking to people at the airline companies or the buses or the van services in my area about how to remove the fragrance emission devices from their vehicles and also from the depots. And I wonder if you can tell me what would be an approach that you would suggest.
Yeah, this is a really, common, I think, issue now. And I'm a person also that is pretty sensitive to chemicals, especially strong fragrances. And we like to go to, the providers of transportation and send out information. We've provided a lot of information around multiple chemical sensitivities, strong odors, fragrances as being a true issue for people, and say to providers, hey, this is a real issue, and we've had providers saying, well, this is up our drivers, like the clean odor. No, the clean odor meaning the scented odor. But we've actually done some education with providers saying, no, this is a real issue. I've also sent providers, there's some Department of Justice links and cases around where there's been some agreements, just in fragrance and chemical sensitivity in all kinds of different settings, but have sent those on to providers and say, look, this is an issue that you need to address, and it could be an issue as far as issue around the ADA for people to use your service, and that if you're not removing the chemicals and the fragrances, you could be discriminating against a certain group of people and their disabilities. So we've done that with people and talked to them. And a lot of times, providers say, oh, I didn't realize, that my fragrance device, and sometimes it's just those hanging things in the van, which are also very strong, but some people actually sprayed different kinds of chemicals in their vehicles. They say, oh, I didn't realize people are that sensitive. But really it's an education of providers, and also that sort of case history of where people can see that it could be problems because it will show true discrimination.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments?
I don't see any more hand raised.
Okay, we'll move on again to the reasonable modification of policies, which is really kind of tied into complaints too. And then, if you have complaints questions, we'll address some more as we go on. So, all right. Also on complaints, there is the FTA circular for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provides some guidance for providers. And then, as far as CILs and everybody, it's good to get familiar with what's in the circular, because circular is what providers look at as far as working through their policies and coming up with ways of providing service. And so we tell anyone who's even making a complaint around the ADA, it's good to even look at the circular to see what providers are looking at. All right, so the reasonable modification and policy issue has been around for a while now. It's been around for about 5 years, but as far as my job is a regular question. I mean, I get questions every week on reasonable modification and policy. And sometimes people will give me a question that just says, what about this situation? How should I interpret it? And then sometimes we get people with disabilities saying, hey, I'm requesting a reasonable modification policy. They say, how should I word it? What's the best way should I go about requesting the reasonable modification? So it was a DOT, Department of Transportation rule issued March 6, 2015. Hit my mute button, sorry about that. And then the final rule was put in effect July 13th, 2015. And at that time, at least I remember in the month of June and part of July, there was a rush with transit providers trying to come up with a change in their policies so it would reflect the reasonable modification rules. So transportation entities are required to make reasonable modification and accommodations to policies, practices, and procedures to avoid discrimination and ensure that their programs are accessible to individuals with disabilities. And so the point in the whole reasonable modification rules is that, you know, transportation providers, like any other entity, must adjust their policies to make sure that there's not that discrimination. And for a lot of transit providers, you know, we say, hey, you're going to be making that decision yourself. So what the DOT did is they added an appendix to the final rule to provide examples and typical situations. And so it lists some real common things. We'll go through some of them in a moment. But the point is that providers must make their own determinations. They can look at these examples, but also to think about, you know, these examples are general guidance, but you're looking at your individual situation and circumstances. How can you ensure that person gets that ride in the way that you provide service? Figuring out a way to make it happen rather than denying the ride. So reasonable modification does apply to fixed route, which applies to demand responsive, or these are, you know, types of transportation where you have to book or call in for a ride. Private shuttles would be like hotel shuttles or different kinds of venue type shuttles. And then of course with ADA complementary paratransit. And the process, it must be set by the transportation provider. So nobody says exactly what your process is. It's a local process, but we tell providers that they should be having a discussion with their local disability community as to what the process should be and what works for people. And most providers probably do it in some way or form and to some degree already, but they need to at least look at their process to make sure that that it really is set up in a way to make people get rides rather than deny service. All right, and your reasonable modification process, any requests must be made from that individual, unless doing so, number one, would be fundamentally alter the nature of the program, their service or activity, providing in a way that you can, or would be a direct threat to the health or safety of others. So if it's a health issue, safety issue, you might not be able to provide it. And then the interesting one, that someone requests a modification, but they could still use your service without the modification, and you know, which I don't think in most cases people are requesting a service unless they really need it. So what's reasonable? You know, that's always been a tough question. A lot of people ask the question, what is a reasonable modification? Well, reasonable, we say it's really case by case, so it's fair and sensible. And I'm quoting John Day from Federal Transit Administration. It's not extreme or excessive or way out of bounds as to what you would normally do. And then I think it's interesting that it's possessing sound judgment in that decision-making process when you look at each individual reasonable modification request. So what's a fundamental alteration of service? That's, you know, a lot of times, you know, that's the reason someone would say, well, we don't do it. Well, it could be that's so significant it alters the essential nature of goods, services, facilities. This is really kind of the ADA definition. Privileges, advantages, or for the accommodations offered. So, you know, it'd be a significant change. You know, a fixed route bus would not deviate like a demand response or ADA paratransit vehicle. And so an example process would be, if you got reasonable modification, you should, again, like the complaints, have information about the process, make it available to the public, must be accessible. It must provide for situations where an individual can make an advance request and where it's not feasible. So somebody might be able to ask for reasonable modification on the vehicle and ask the drivers, so that operator should be able to make some ad hoc determination. And this way, then the operators need to be trained around reasonable modification. And operators may need to contact supervisors for assistance. And then, you know, if you're working with any providers, if you're a CIL or disability organization, a lot of times then in your training with operators and training with management, and training with operations people, a training around reasonable modification can be very important. All right, process consideration, just like the complaints, review and track the request for reasonable modification, and then make sure that, you know, for that individual, make sure their transportation is accessible. Just like the complaint too, appoint a single lead staff person. It could be an ADA coordinator, an accessibility manager, it could be an operations person, but some person that follows those requests. And some smaller provider agencies, the complaint manager and the person that's making these reasonable modification requests or following up with them is the same person. And again, like complaints, there's a formal process for tracking those requests. Again, you're logging it in, and then you're having information as to what happened when the request was made and when was there follow-up with the individual. So more points on the process. I like to say the bus drivers, operations staff, road supervisors, and other personnel should be trained on personnel and recognizing requests and what does it include. I've done actually and with some providers a whole day training with all staff within the transit organization, including maintenance people, on reasonable modification and what that entails. Transit agencies and providers should have a timeline and deadlines for completing reasonable modification requests. They would be resolved quickly. There's communication between the customer and any staff handling that reasonable modification request. And that there's, in that process, there may be input from safety operations or someone else within the transit agencies. Some transit providers actually will go out and look at situations when someone makes a request in a particular place or issue, and then look at the situation before they look at follow up with the individual. So then the final issue for providers, they will either grant or deny that request, but that should not even be made without some good interactive follow-up with the individual. Advanced requests, again, and this is what's is fairly common, is that people may request in advance by mail, by phone, by email, through the website or writing or some way of communicating with the provider. And then the provider should always say that they're going to contact the individual for additional information. And the decision will be made in a certain amount of time, so the provider can say, hey, we're going to respond to you, within 10 days, within 2 weeks or something. There's a reasonable time frame for follow-up. And then they will also have information as to how that decision will be sent to the person. So it'll be email, would it be by some other form like letter, and then will they actually send a written decision along with a phone call and let the person know. So one issue we hear a lot of times, people say, well, it's reasonable modification policy around the person's disability. Now, if a person is requesting a reasonable modification policy, should we ask if that person has a disability? All right. Question, we like to say, not necessarily. You don't need to know exactly the disability itself, but you could just find out what the reasonable modification is as a request and what functional limitations may that person have around using your service rather than details around the disability itself. But a lot of times we hear providers saying, oh, but we want to know what their disability is. That's not always just the information you need. So anyway, just like the complaints, information about reasonable modification should be available to the public, must be accessible, and there must be a process, again, to make sure that it's available in ways when advance request is not feasible. So it could be the operator making the determination or supervisors. So different typical things would be like snow and ice, fair handling, eating and drinking, these dedicated vehicles, and could be other things, and could be just issues for that specific individual that we're not looking at here. How about a policy like this? This is a sort of example. No food or drink. A lot of times you get in a vehicle, there's a sign, no food or drinks available. But how about someone or a rider who has diabetes or other medical conditions? Should they be allowed to eat or drink on a vehicle at stops or stations? Or just when they need fluid. So if you have a no food or drink policy, of course, you would probably say, whoops, I think I flipped over here. You would probably think, of course, that would be something that if someone has a condition that no food or drink policy should at least be modified for those individuals. And some people coming out of dialysis come out with fluids as they're leaving. How about requests for special equipment? We get told sometimes people will say, hey, I like to sit in a certain seat. If you can guarantee that a person can sit in a certain seat on a vehicle, then that should be done. But it's up to the provider. And then sometimes people call and they say, oh, I just want a ride in a old van. Now this sounds funny. We have people that say the newer vans are too bouncy. The older vans had a smoother ride. And they said, I like this older van because it's easier on my back. Now, could that be granted? If you could do it, we would say, sure. The provider could do it. If they can't guarantee that the older van would be for your trip, they may say, no, we can't guarantee that. If it can happen, then the provider should at least consider a way to make sure that happens. Boarding location is pretty common. You might have a pick-off or drop-off point that's, say, in front of the house in a certain place, but, you might look at an individual who says, oh, come on down here to the corner. It's easier for me to board there. And so the individual provider should at least probably, go down to that corner if it's easier for that individual and board, because that's more accessible for that person. A lot of times they say, oh yeah, we always just stop at the front of the house. Well, it might not be the best spot. Interesting one, this is a call I've gotten several times where someone's on a commuter bus that's going actually a fair distance, and an individual asks for a bathroom break. You think about a commuter bus, a lot of times, some commuter buses actually have a restroom for riders, some do not. But if a ride is long, is there really need for that bus to stop for that individual that can't use that restroom? And so the point really, I think, here is, yes, there's, normally a commuter bus doesn't stop, but if it's a long ride and, there's restroom on the bus, it might be reasonable to say that, for this long trip, people that can't use this restroom because it's not accessible, we're going to stop for a bathroom break. A real common question we get now, how about adjusting time of pickup after dialysis? And this question, I think, is almost most weekly now, where we have individuals and providers, you know, saying we got people that, well, they're not ready when dialysis is over. Well, we tell the provider, hey, you know, you may need to have some flexibility to adjust the time for those individuals, and they should consider for dialysis, chemotherapy, or even some other medical procedures to adjust the time of the pickup. So sometimes you have dialysis pickup scheduled at a certain time, but the individual may be too tired, or dialysis started late, or they're just not ready to ride. You know, they need some rest, and they say, oh, I need to get picked up an hour later. Providers should, we think, at least consider picking up that individual so they're more able to ride. Long driveways. I have a photograph of a very long driveway, kind of almost like where I'm at right now. But this is a long driveway going back to a house that's a part of a farm. And there are some providers that say, oh, we don't go back long driveways because we don't know what we're going to run into if we don't know what's at the other end. And so what we like to tell providers, if you have that situation, can someone go out and look at it? Can they go down that long driveway and see if that ride's possible? You can ride down it, you can go to the end, you can turn around if it works, or you can find a way that you can still make that trip. But in that case, you know, if you have a no lane policy, look at individual lanes, see if it can be done. You know, for some individuals, you know, without the ride and without the vehicle going down a long ride, they're not going to get connected to services. So in summary, reasonable modifications are made on a case-by-case basis, and it's interactive, just like with the complaints. Communication is key, of course, just like in the complaints. And we tell people again that when reasonable modifications are given, providers need to be thinking about their process as a way of filling in the gaps of accessibility with good customer service flexibility, meaning that you'll find out ways to try to make that person get a ride. So the request can be a result of a complaint. So it could be part of that discussion between the individual and the provider. So the provider may work on looking at a complaint and then accommodating a specific need. Focus should always be on making a ride possible rather than denying the ride. And then providers and individuals should come up with creative ways to make sure that ride happens. So sometimes feedback from the individual, even with input from the CIL, other disability groups, to an interactive process, people may come up with a way to make the ride happen. All right, I guess we're almost at the end of time here, so it's time for a few more questions.
So just remember, you can select the hand raise option, or if you are on phone or using keystrokes, you can press *9. And there is one in the Q&A box.
All right. I'm going to read this one. Sorry, Sierra.
Okay.
Are reasonable accommodations made only for people who take paratransit?
Oh, that's a good question. No, and reasonable modification is for any provider who's providing service. So it's not just paratransit, it's not just fixed route. It can be for shuttles, it can be for a commuter, it can be for rail, it can be for the other types of providers. Those sticky ones still is yet we're trying to figure out what to do with TNCs, the Uber, Lyft, and that sort of thing. And it's not we, but I guess it's just as someone needs to kind of say, hey, TNC's got to be like taxi providers, because taxi providers need to at least think about making reasonable modifications when they provide services for people with disabilities too. And, in my mind, this is my opinion, that TNCs need providing at least that same level of service as taxi providers.
And Ken, we have another question. Are they allowed to print your PowerPoint slides?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Great.
And just to let you know, that presentation is on the conference website as well, so you can access it there. And there is one question on the, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I'm just wondering, what is the easiest way or what is the best way if you are disconnected from a ride, in terms of a distance? At times we call to book and they tell you that you cannot go to that place because it is not in the ADA, like where you have to go. Yes,
Okay, so they're saying it's not in the service area.
exactly.
Yeah, and that is a limitation for ADA transportation. So if you're doing ADA complementary paratransit, that service is 3/4 mile on either side of fixed route. And so there's no obligation under the law for providers to go outside the 3/4 of a mile. And so providers won't. So, and the reason why they don't is this, it's determined that if a provider goes outside the 3/4 of mile area, and then they go pick up a one person beyond it, then they have to travel that same distance in their service area for everybody. So if you go 1/4 mile out of 3/4 mile, say you do a mile, then you would have to make your service area basically a mile on either side. And so everybody would have, because if you do it for one person, then you're discriminating against everybody else. So that's why they don't. But if they can't, then you want to talk to the providers or someone else that can go outside that service area and get a person and maybe bring them into the service area. There's a woman that I worked with by phone where she was outside the service area. She's in a fairly rural area, and there was only one bus that went up this road, and it only went up, once an hour. And she lived outside that 3/4 mile area, and she lived about a little over 1/4 mile. And we got a map, and we looked, and we tried to find ways because she just wanted to come in using ADA paratransit for some trips a couple times a month. And we found someone that would take her to a library that was just on the edge of the service area. And she got a ride, but that was just, it was kind of lucky that she found somebody that could get her to the service area, because she really needed the lift-equipped vehicle, accessible vehicle. But she found a church volunteer and the church had a van, and they would pick her up. That was the kind of situation, but there is no requirement if you're an ADA paratransit to go beyond that.
Thank you
it
very
makes it real tough, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
We have about 4 more minutes, and there's some in the Q&A box we can hopefully have time to get to.
Okay.
All right, Ken. Janet George asks a question. I have appreciated the announcements on fixed route buses, but more often than not, they are turned way down. When I talk with the driver, he says, I can't do anything about it. Any suggestions of what to do? Yes,
that's a real good question, because they're turned down. And for some drivers, some systems, the driver has no control over the fixed route. It's a preset volume. And then in some buses, it's an ambient noise situation. So the stop announcements adjust automatically by the sound on the vehicle. And those sometimes can be, all over the place, depending on the noise. But I would always say to people, if you have that issue and you can't hear stop announcements, that is definitely an ADA issue, because you know, stop announcements are key for you to complete your trip. So we say go to the provider and put in that complaint and say that, you know, do the complaint process where you have the bus, the time, the model, and make complaints whenever that volume is low, and then hopefully maintenance and operations people can go say, hey, yeah, you know, people can't hear the stop announcements. We got to get into the system and make the volume louder. You know, the preset ones are sometimes you know, kind of tough, and then there's some that you know, it's supposed to be one volume all the time, and you know, the driver, and even in maintenance, it's not a quick fix, but make that complaint so the volume can be usable for you.
And Ken, we have about a minute for the last question, and Renee Holder asks, I know that businesses are not allowed to ask what your disability is when you have a service animal. They are only allowed to ask what function the animal performs. Do transportation entities have to follow these same rules?
Yes, they have to follow the same rules. So the entity has to say, you know, what tasks does the animal perform, and you know, they can say, is that a service animal, if they're not sure. But yeah, that's it. Same question, same way. There's really no difference.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you to all the attendees. Your feedback is so critical, so please make sure that you complete the evaluation that's in the chat box. And thank you all for your time. Thank you, Ken, for such a wonderful session.
Right, thank you. Take care.